For this video, I've done something a little different. I've finished the entire scene, and it's a lot more complex than the ones we've used before, but rest assured, it uses only the things that we've already learned and covered. This is just putting those things together in a much more complex way. So to save time, because it would take a long time to build this on screen in front of you, I'm going to walk you through it step by step and show you what's going on. So here in the scene, I've got just a basic wall frame with a couple of doors. And we've got a little keycard object and a control panel with a button. And I have another control panel and keycard over here as well. And the idea is that I want to introduce several things. I want to introduce quest stages. And quests can be something like mission objectives or goals or anything like that that you want to have definite markers of success for your player and stages along the way that they achieve before you give them further challenge or further reward. This is how you would track something like that. We're going to have 3 stages of quest to get through this door. And the buttons are going to be a method of lockout. You can't get through the doors until you activate the buttons, but you can't activate the buttons until you get a hold of the key cards. So this is a way that you can do multi-staged blocks of progression or unlocking of various stages of difficulty and challenge and reward for your players. This is a pretty basic example, but it's the same sort of scenario you could use to advance waves or give out rewards or control any number of things in games. It's a pretty good template for this sort of thing. So let me fire this up and show you what's going on. We start the game, and up in the left, we have text that says, find the door and exit this area. So that's our first player goal. Well, here's the door right over here. I guess I found it. So when I enter this area, I've got a trigger, a very big one, that says find a way to unlock the door controls. It advances the text there in the upper left. And try as I might, bonk. I just can't get through these doors, bonk. And if I come over to the control panels and click on them, I just get a beep. It won't let me through. And they're red, telling me that it doesn't work. So at this point, I can go looking for the key cards because it says find a way to unlock the door controls. Now, these key cards, they could be, levers you pull, or they could be collect 27 gems or anything you want. And they don't have to be the same. The point is that there's something to obtain or achieve before you can get through these. So these are set up just like our other objects where I can run over them and collect it. And if you look on the upper right now, it says 1 of 2. I've set up a thing that is tracking how many key cards we have. And if I use it now, that one turns green, shows I've unlocked it. And if I click on it, I no longer get the beep, but it also doesn't do anything. And this one doesn't activate because I only have 1 of 2. So if I collect this one, come up to the unit, and then the doors open, get a little sound, and I can now proceed out the level. And if you look in the upper left, it says exit through the door. We've advanced the quest stage again for the player. And if you look in the upper right, we've removed the counter. It's no longer there because the player doesn't need to worry about any number of things anymore. So exit through the door, and we fade to black and leave the level. So that's it. That's how it runs. And let's step through this and show you what's going on. So let's start out by looking at the interactive objects in the scene. Here we've got a key card, and this is a simple object, just a simple piece of mesh with a trigger around it, much like some of the other things we've done before. I put a quick little texture on it. And the wiring is pretty simple. On the key card, we've got a rotate state, and all it does is rotate. That is the only action that's in this FSM at all. So it just sets it to rotate for 90 degrees around the Y angle continuously. And on the trigger, we've got a listener that is a on-trigger enter event for when somebody collides with this trigger. And when that happens, it sends an event to the quest manager right here. And there you go. And that handles a lot of the routing. We're going to look at that later. And then it figures out who its parent is and destroys itself. So it cleans itself up just like most of the other objects I've shown you recently. And this one is exactly the same way. Trigger with the cleanup and the key card with rotate. So they are both exactly the same. These could be prefabbed and moved all over the place because they are sending an event to the quest manager that just says, hey, keycard collected. And we'll take a look at how that handles that event here in a couple of minutes. So the control panels are also pretty simply wired up. It's a basic stand object and a separated button object. And I put the button tag on it. I made a custom tag called buttons and added it on. And that way, when I use the click manager to click around and control things in the scene, I can tell whether or not I've clicked on a button. And if it's a button, I need to do something special. And if it's not, I can completely ignore the click. So that is the reason for flagging that. The stand has absolutely no wiring or anything on it. And the control panel parent object itself is what has the FSM. It's a pretty simple setup. The setup state puts the material color to red. Then it flows into this listener, which hangs out and waits for a clicked on event. There's a B1 clicked on event for button 1. And in this one, there's a B2 clicked on event for button 2. Right there, as I've named them individually. When that event gets sent from the quest manager, then it goes to the unlock state, which sets the material color to green instead of red. And it clears the tag. So instead of being buttons up on the tag, as this is now, it says buttons, it clears it out to be nothing. So that way it appears to be insignificant according to the click manager from there on out, and it pays no attention to it, which is why this button doesn't beep after it turns green. The click manager is not recognizing it as something that needs beeping. And this button, this stand is exactly the same way wired up. Now for the door object, pretty simple too. It's got a simple frame and a couple of doors that are going to do that sliding that we saw. There's a simple FSM that sets up a listener waiting for an open door event, which again is sent from the quest manager down here. So when it receives an open door event, it goes into this sound and texture FSM, and that plays that bell sound that we heard. Then it sets the material once here and once here for the left and right doors. It sets it to a green texture, just like this red one, except it's got green on it. So that it's kind of like if you changed a light, and you'd want to play particle effects, probably of some steam or all kinds of different things like that. Maybe animations, little gizmos on doors. All that magic would happen right here. And then I wait for 1 second. So you hear the bell, you get a little bit of anticipation, and then it flows into an iTween move, which uses a quad ease in out to give that kind of nice, smooth door opening rather than just a linear, kind of ugly thing. So there's one iTween move 2 for each door, left and right. And that's it. That is all that happens here. And when that's done, it just terminates itself and hangs out because that is the end of what it needs to do. So that is all these objects do. They're very simple. They just report when they've been picked up, when they're interacted with, when they don't need to be interacted with, that sort of thing. They are as basic as I could possibly set them up, and that makes them leaner. They run better. They're easier to bug fix. They're easier to make. They're more portable to move around and use multiple times. And they're a lot easier to modify as you may need to in your game. So that's it for the scene objects. Let's take a peek at the text objects right now and see what's going on. I've got 2 GUI text objects, a GUI text quest counter and a GUI text quest step. And they're both regular GUI text objects, and I've got them positioned so the text appears coming off the left here. Its anchor's actually about at this spot and comes over. And the other one, the counter, is right here about where its anchor is. And they both have an FSM on them. I wanted to really show how you could have multiple managers. I've got 4 here in the scene that are all working together to get things done. So let's start with the quest steps. I initially set up 3 variables here, quest text 1, 2, and 3. And if you were doing a really big game with a lot of dialogue or a lot of story points, you would probably be pulling your text out of a dialogue database or some kind of text or XML file of some nature. But in this case, I'm not localizing or anything, so I'm just setting them up directly here. So I've got 3 strings, text 1, text 2, and text 3. And in the setup state of the GUI text quest step, I enter the text that displays up there. So find the door and exit this area, and find a way to unlock the door and exit through the door. I assign the value of these 3 text variables right here in the setup state. And this would be similar to, pulling the text out of a database or something, like I said. But here we've coded it right in, and then I set the int value to 1 for quest stage, which I've made as a global variable. And this is something that several of the managers are all using to track which stage of the quest we're at. Are we at stage 1, 2, or 3? And 1, 2, and 3 coincides with quest text 1, 2, and 3. So I've kept it pretty simple. So that's set to a value of 1 by default because we want this first text here, the find the door and exit this area, to appear by default when we start up this level. And set GUI text is what I do at the end and set it to quest text 1. So from here on out, I'm just going to use these variables and assign them to these actual objects in the game, and they will display whatever text is in the variable. So pretty easy. Then we flow into the listener, and that just waits around for the event advanced quest stage. And that event is global. So it can be accessed, like we were talking about, from many different objects and the other managers. So pretty much it's going to hang out and wait for the quest manager is what's going on there. When it receives an advanced quest stage event, it comes down here to the quest check. And what it does is a simple int switch, and it checks that quest stage global, that variable, and it sees if it's equal to 1 or 2. Now we don't have to check for 1 because it's set to 1 by default, so there's no bother to check. So I check for stage 2 or stage 3, and if it's 2 or 3, we go to the appropriate state here. And in state 2, all I do is update the GUI text to say quest text 2. Right? And in state 3, I do the same thing, update to say quest text 3. And with the finished event, I flow back into the listener. So that's all that's going on with this FSM. It just sets up what its text is going to be, and then it waits for kind of a clicker event, it says, hey, move to the next one, hey, move to the next one. And then it handles the dirty work of actually doing that. Now, in the quest text counter, we have a slightly more complex FSM. But it's not doing too much more than that, really. This is the one that handles the numbers. And we need to turn it on and off because it's only visible during state 2. It's not visible during states 1 and 3. And during state 2, it has 3 different states of its own. It has 0 of 0, 0 of 2, 1 of 2, and 2 of 2 that it can possibly display to the user. And that's dependent upon whether or not you've picked up these keycards. So in the setup state for this, well, first of all, the variables, I have counter stage 1, 2, and 3, much like quest text 1, 2, and 3, and I have a counter stage variable that I've set up. These are strings, and this one is an int, and this lets me track what state we're at with that. So the setup has string value, just like I set up the text in this other one. I enter 0 of 2, 1 of 2, and 2 of 2 for these variables, these strings. And then I set the int value of our counter stage right away. I set that to 0. And that means it's not stage 1 because we're gonna assume this is stage 1, counter stage 1 with the text of 0 of 2. So stage 0 means we're not displaying it at all, and 0 is a valid stage. So then we flow into the listener and we wait for 2 events again. They're both going to come from the quest manager. So we have a listener waiting for update counter and remove counter. So update counter, first of all, it's much like the text. It flows in. It does an int add to the counter stage. So it starts at counter 0, right? And it says move to the next state. So it comes in, adds 1. So this variable is now equal to 1. And then it does an int switch, which checks for stages 1, 2, and 3. Got 3 switches, 1, 2, and 3, and they flow out to update 1, 2, and 3. And pretty easily, these also just set the GUI text. So stage 1 sets it to 1, stage 2 sets it to 2, and update stage 3 sets this to 3. And both of them flow back into the listener. So again, this is just a really simple loop that advances you through those 3 states. And when it receives a remove counter event, all it does is set the int value of this counter stage back to 0, just so we know we're not using it again. This is in the event that you may want to pick up more keycards later or reuse this sort of a thing. I don't have to do it right here, but it's good habit to clean things up. And then I set the GUI text, and this I just clean out. I say set it to nothing, and then I enter nothing in this field. So that wipes it out and makes it disappear again. So again, when you first look at it, you think, wow, there's a lot going on here. And there really isn't. It's pretty simple. It just advances through this numerical thing and counts up until it reaches 3, and then we have an event that cleans it out. So those 2 objects handle all of the text display in the entire level. Now let's take a look at the last few things that make up this scene. I have a update quest trigger, and it's pretty large. I've placed it around pretty much everything in the scene, and all this does is hang out with a onTrigger event and waiting for somebody to enter the trigger, and then when it does, it sends an event to the quest manager, and it calls this advanced quest state. And that bumps forward the state of the quest and the text. And if you remember, if we look over here, when we first start out, it says find the door and exit this area. When we enter this trigger, it advances the quest and pops up the 0 of 2 and the other text and destroys itself and gets out of the scene. So that's all it really does, but it's pretty key. Now the exit trigger I've placed is another big trigger, and I've just placed it so there's no way you could get through this door without actually hitting this trigger. And that's pretty easy as well. It waits out with a onTrigger event, and when that exit level event's triggered, it does a camera fade out over 2 seconds to black, and at the end of that, it fires this done fading event, which would go to a level load, which I've deactivated for this example, because there's no reason to go somewhere else when we're talking about this one. So those 2 triggers right there make up a couple of really key things, but again, really easy setup on them. And finally, I have these last 2 managers, the Go Click Manager and the Go Quest Manager. I'll start with the Click Manager. It looks a little more complex here. It starts out and goes into a listener that waits for a get mouse button down. And in this case, I'm looking for the left click. So this watches the whole scene and waits for somebody to click on the left button. And when that happens, it fires off a click check event, which runs into this button check. And I then do a mouse pick to find out what went on. So I store the name of the object in the object clicked, and that's pretty much all I'm doing here. But I also filter using a layer mask. Then we come into game object compare tag, and I check the object you just clicked on, which we generated right up here. I come down here and check it against a tag. Are you buttons? So remember, I tagged those things for buttons. And then if it is a button, if those 2 things match, I fire off this is a button event. And if it's not, I do nothing and flow right back into the listener. So in the case of a button, the next thing I need to do is check to see if the player is actually holding either of these 2 key cards. That is a simple int compare. So once again, key cards held. And if you remember, we update that value every time we pick one of these up. So if they have 1, like if it equals 1 or is greater than 1, which would mean 1 or 2, because they might have 1, they might have both, then I do an unlock event. And if they don't, if they have less than 1, I do a buzz. And the buzz simply plays that buzz sound. And what this does is allow me to have a situation where the player could click on either button and have no key cards, so it buzzes. They could pick up 1 key card and click on 1 button, and then click on the other button and still get a buzz, or they could pick up both key cards before ever clicking on a button and click on both of them. Any of those scenarios, the player can do whatever they want, and this one little int compare will take care of all of that for us. So the unlock state flows into a button chooser. Subtract 1 from the key cards held, because we assume you have spent a key card in order to unlock that platform. And the game object compare is used again. So once again, we use the thing we clicked on that we got way back up here when we did the mouse pick. So we check against that and see if it is indeed a button. So in this case, I'm specifically looking to see, is it button number 1? And I do another object compare to see, is it button number 2? And those things are located right there in the control panels that we looked at earlier. So that's it. If what you've clicked on is either of those buttons, after making sure that you have one of these key cards, then it fires the event for button 1 or button 2. And button 1 and button 2 are similar. All it does is send an event to that specific button that says, hey, you have been clicked on. They're both exactly the same, except they call that particular stand. And if you remember right, these buttons, then when they get that clicked on event, unlock themselves and turn green. So that simple, just a nice little connection. Finally, once we've finished with both of these buttons, they both flow into the door check. Because remember, after we unlock both buttons, we have to check to see if they're both open, we're going to open the door. So after each one is clicked on, we do a check. And if only one, if unlocked doors is the variable I'm using there to track that, I add 1 to it right away. So the first door is clicked, unlocked doors now equals 1. I check against it. If it's equal to 2, right here, same variable, then I open the doors. If it's not, I do nothing. That way, either button you check on will advance this to 1. So you can play this out multiple times. You can click on them completely different orders, and each way it's going to work out. If you were to check specifically for each button, you'd have much more complex wiring, and it gets really ridiculous, and it really takes away player control. So it's much better to do it numerically. And if you open the doors, it's a simple send event to the door exit object. And that's this whole construction here. And what that sends off, if you remember, is the open doors event, which does the whole playing sound and moving the doors. So pretty simple, send that event there. And then I also send an event to the quest text counter. And this is the remove counter. So once we've opened the doors, if you remember, we fire off this remove counter event here, which comes in and updates this so that the counter on the upper right-hand corner, the 2 of 2 at this point, goes away completely. So this is what handles all that. But again, completely managed and fired off by the click manager right here in the open doors. And both the click manager and the door check, when they're done, go back up to the listener. So just hanging around waiting for another button press. And that is all that's going on in the click manager. Again, it looks like a lot, and it kind of is. You have to put these things in the right order. Remember, first I click, then did you click on a button? Yeah, it's a button. Did the player have any cards when they clicked on the button? Because if you don't have any cards, it's not worth checking all this other stuff, right? It's not even worth going through it. We just play a buzz, going, nope. But if they do, then we have to find out which button is it. And in that button, do we need to unlock it, or should we just ignore it? And then once we've unlocked the doors, or once we've unlocked the buttons, can we unlock the doors? So it's this logical chain of events. If you think it through, you'll find that kind of a flow. And if you're having trouble, just write it out on a piece of paper, and don't try to do it exactly like this. Just do it like I just said. Was it a button? Is the button, do you have a key card? Was the thing unlocked? Just go through the steps, and then you can come back here once you've thought it through and make that sort of a logic flow. So finally, we get to the quest manager, and this is really the master brain of the whole thing. Even though a lot of the click manager and these GUI text managers do a lot of the heavy lifting, The quest manager is the orchestrator of the whole thing. And you come into the setup and you set the initial value to 0 of key cards held. It's because I want to make absolutely sure that this is set to nothing. Then we come into a listener, and the listener hangs out and waits for stuff from all these different objects. So it needs to pay attention to the cards. So we have a card collected event, and that's what the card fires off when it's picked up. We have a terminal unlocked event, and that is what waits and pays attention to these button states. So when they turn themselves green and fire that event off, this is what gets set. And the advanced quest is what is fired off to move the quest states forward. I have one simple thing that a lot of different objects can hit, and what that does is step through and updates the numerical value of our quest stage global. So we've indeed advanced it immediately, and then we do an int switch to find out, are we in stage 2 or 3? We advance to 2 or 3, depending on that number. And in 2, we send events to both turn on the quest's counter, those little numbers that appear up here, and we also advance the regular test or text. And in number 3, we don't have to turn on the counter because they're already on, and in fact, they're being handled and turned off. So we just advance the text up here in quest step. So those two things happen, and when they're done, they both flow back into the listener because, of course, you're only doing one of these at a time, so we handle those 3 discrete things. Looking at the other 2, the card collected takes you right in here, and again, it updates the number of cards used right here. So I just have it managed in this one place for adding, and we remove it here when it's spent on the control panel. And then we send an event to the quest counter to update that we have indeed collected a card. So everything handles its own local stuff except the quest manager, which is orchestrating all these events. Terminal unlocked handles when one of these turns itself green. And so what we do is add an int right there as well. And we do a compare to check whether or not we open the doors. And opening the doors sends an event to this whole structure. And then loops, it loops through here as well because it has to do this quest update after it opens itself. And that is it. That is all the complexity of this entire scene. A few final thoughts about this scene. One of them is there are a couple logic breakers in here. First of all, the keycards are available at any point for the player to pick up. Of course, I didn't do anything to restrict access to them, so you can grab them right away, and it kind of still works, but there are easily areas in which this could break completely some of the logic, so you want to be careful of things like that when you're building your scenes. You don't want them to completely come apart because somebody gets to an area before you wanted them to, or activate something before you were ready for that in the code. You could physically restrict access to that by putting these things in another area. You could spawn them when you fired off this trigger, the one that's right down here to update the quest. You could have that spawn these elements, so there's no possible way that they could exist before you're ready for them. So lots of things like that you can think about. Another thing is there should be a whole lot more user feedback if you're really building a game like this. These things should beep, have 2 or 3 different sounds at least. These should have some particle effects on them and some kind of sound and visual effect when you pick them up. There should be, feedback, multiple types of feedback, visual, audio, text, everything you can possibly do, animations in game. Don't just do one thing. Do as much as you possibly can as feedback for the player about what's going on, because they'll really enjoy it. It makes your world feel alive, but also sometimes you just don't get one of them. They might have their sound turned off, and so this wouldn't mean anything. If you're playing on an iPhone on a busy bus, or you're playing after your spouse has gone to bed, something like that, you're just not going to hear this stuff. So you need multiple ways to do it. All those sorts of things, keep in mind. Give as much feedback as you can about every stage of this when you wire this up in your game. I just did 1 or 2 simple things to show you where it would be and how it would work. Finally, These don't have to be key cards and locks and, that whole kind of crazy go get my gem thing to unlock a treasure chest. These could be anything. They could be different too. If you were getting through a door, this could be a boss battle. You'd have to kill a big monster or something in order to access a key that would let you do that. And this one over here could be that you had to do a whole other chain of quests, or maybe you're in a 2D game, and this means you have to collect 50 gems in your regular gameplay, and this means you've got to get like 12 of them have to be red or something like that. And then each of those, these don't even have to be physical buttons or unlocks. It could just be this is level 2, and if you get 50 gems and 12 red ones, then you achieve each of these things, which then enable you to take the final actions like get the one yellow gem and then you can move on. This doesn't have to be a 3D kind of sci fi quest sort of a thing here. So keep that in mind as well. They could be, you know, that sort of setup. It could be levers, it could be monsters, these could be numerical things. These elements could be hours apart in a game if you wanted them to be. So lots of variety here. Don't think that this is the one and only way to do this. It's the logic I'm trying to show you of how you'd hook up different managers to work with each other, how you'd update some user feedback, and how you'd have multiple little objects all working together and yet be as simple as possible to use. And that is how you'd set up a scene like this.